Imagine you're on death row, the clock ticking down your final hours. It's a surreal countdown, where every minute is a stark reminder of the life you've lived and the fate that awaits. Fear, regret, maybe a flicker of hope, all colliding as the clock ticks down to zero. We're about to step into this world, exploring the last day of those facing the ultimate sentence. From their final meal to the last words they utter, get ready for an unflinching glimpse into these final fleeting moments. Aileen Wuornos. Let's start things off with Aileen Wuornos. Born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, Wuornos's father, a convicted child molester, was never a part of her life, having been incarcerated before her birth. Her mother abandoned Wuornos and her brother early on, leaving them in the care of their grandparents, who legally adopted them. However, this was far from a nurturing environment. Wuornos faced physical and sexual abuse, and by the age of 11, she was trading sexual favors for cigarettes, drugs, and food. At 14, she became pregnant, bearing a son, who was subsequently given up for adoption. Her grandmother died of liver failure when Wuornos was just 15, and a year later, her grandfather threw her out of the house, leaving her homeless and fending for herself. Wuornos's descent into a life of crime began with minor offenses, but by the 1980s, she was working as a sex worker on Florida's highways. It was during this time that her violent tendencies fully surfaced. In 1989, Wuornos committed her first murder, killing a man who had picked her up for sex. This act marked the beginning of a killing spree that would last until 1990, claiming the lives of 7 men. Wuornos's method was consistent. She would shoot her victims at point-blank range before robbing them. The media dubbed her the Damsel of Death, a moniker that reflected the seemingly cold and calculated nature of her crimes. The unraveling of Wuornos's crimes began with the discovery of the bodies of her victims, leading to a nationwide manhunt. She was eventually apprehended in 1991 at a biker bar in Florida. Her lover, Tyria Moore, played a crucial role in eliciting Wuornos's confession. Wuornos was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder and received 6 death sentences as a result. Wuornos's time on death row was marked by a significant shift in her demeanor. Initially, she claimed that her killings were acts of self-defense against violent clients. However, as time passed, she began to express remorse for her actions, acknowledging that she had killed in cold blood. In her last interview, she spoke of being tortured by prison staff and claimed that her mind was being controlled by sonic pressure. Despite these claims, she refused a special meal before her execution, opting instead for a cup of coffee. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. Her last words were cryptic and somewhat defiant. "Yes, I would just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus, June 6th. The movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back." Following her execution, Wuornos's body was cremated, and her ashes were scattered beneath a tree in Michigan. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy grew up in a troubled household where he faced physical and emotional abuse from his alcoholic father. Despite these challenges, he tried to fit into society, eventually marrying and moving to Waterloo, Iowa. There, he managed 3 KFC restaurants. However, beneath this facade lay a dark secret. In 1968, Gacy's life took a sinister turn when he was convicted of sexually assaulting 2 young boys. After serving 18 months of a 10-year sentence, Gacy returned to Chicago, where he started a construction business. He became a well-known figure in his community, often performing as Pogo the Clown at children's parties and charitable events. This double life masked his true nature. Gacy's home in Norwood Park became the site of horrific crimes. He lured young men and boys with promises of work or money, only to brutally assault and murder them. His method was cold and calculated, burying many of his victims in the crawl space beneath his house. The turning point came in December 1978 with the disappearance of Robert Piest, a 15-year-old boy. This led to an investigation that uncovered the gruesome reality of Gacy's crimes. In December 1978, police arrested Gacy, and a search of his home revealed the horrifying extent of his murders. He confessed to killing 33 young men and boys, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. Gacy's trial began in February 1980, where he faced charges for 33 murders. Despite attempts to plead insanity, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. Gacy spent 14 years on death row, where he took up painting, often depicting clowns. As his execution date approached, Gacy's demeanor was a mix of resignation and defiance. For his last meal, he requested a bucket of KFC chicken, a dozen fried shrimp, French fries, and a Diet Coke, a nod to his past life managing KFC restaurants. In the final moments before his execution, Gacy's last words were reported as "kiss my ass," a defiant end to a life marked by cruelty and violence. On May 10, 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection at the Stateville Correctional Center. His death brought an end to a saga that had haunted the nation for years. Following his execution, Gacy's body was cremated. Life of unimaginable horror hidden behind the mask of an everyday citizen. Wesley Allen Dodd. Wesley Allen Dodd's life and crimes paint a chilling portrait of a man whose actions culminated in one of the most notorious cases in criminal history. Born on July 3, 1961, Dodd's childhood was marked by troubling behavior. As a teenager, he began with seemingly minor offenses, but these early transgressions were a prelude to far more sinister behavior. By the time he reached adulthood, Dodd had transformed into a predator, his actions driven by a deep-seated and dangerous pathology. The turning point in Dodd's criminal career came with the abduction and murder of 3 young boys in Vancouver, Washington in 1989. The brutality of these crimes shocked the community and law enforcement alike. Dodd's method was cold and calculated. He lured his victims with the promise of fun or treats, only to unleash his cruel intentions upon them. The capture of Wesley Dodd was as dramatic as his crimes. In November 1989, his attempt to abduct a young boy from a movie theater was thwarted, leading to his arrest. This arrest opened the floodgates to a horrifying discovery. During the investigation, authorities uncovered evidence of Dodd's gruesome activities, including detailed diaries where he recounted his crimes with chilling precision. Dodd's guilt was quickly established, and he was sentenced to death for his crimes. As Dodd awaited his execution, his demeanor was one of eerie calmness. He spent his time on death row in Walla Walla, Washington, largely in isolation, a state that seemed to suit his withdrawn and introspective nature. In a rare display of reflection, Dodd authored a pamphlet on child safety, an act some saw as a twisted form of atonement for his unforgivable sins. For his last meal, he requested a simple yet symbolic choice: broiled salmon and fried potatoes, a nod perhaps to his Pacific Northwest roots. As the hour of his execution drew near, Dodd was led to the gallows, a method of execution he had specifically chosen. His last words, though brief, hinted at a man who had come to terms with the consequences of his actions. He spoke of finding hope and peace, and was finally executed on January 5, 1993. Barbara Graham. Born into a troubled life, Barbara Graham turned to prostitution at a young age, immersing herself in a world of gambling and illegal drugs. Her life was a series of ups and downs, marked by failed marriages and associations with known criminals. It was her connection with criminals Jack Santo and Emmett Perkins that led her down the darkest path of her life. In a twisted turn of events, Graham, along with Santo and Perkins, planned to rob an elderly woman, Mabel Monahan, believing she had a stash of cash and jewelry. The plan went horribly wrong. They brutally beat Monahan, leaving her for dead, but found no money. This crime, however, marked the beginning of the end for Graham. The police quickly connected the dots, leading to Graham's arrest. During her trial, the evidence against her was overwhelming. Witness testimonies and physical evidence painted a grim picture, and the public dubbed her Bloody Babs, a nickname that stuck due to the brutality of her crime and her perceived lack of remorse. Convicted of first-degree murder, Graham's fate was sealed. Her appeals failed, and her execution date was set for June 3, 1955. The night before her execution, Graham was visibly uneasy, pacing back and forth in her cell. The prison warden, perhaps sensing her terror, tried to comfort her, allowing her to indulge in as many double chocolate milkshakes as she desired. Yet, it was a rather small comfort before she was led into the gas chamber blindfolded, as she had requested. Her last words were, "Good people are always so sure they're right." Ted Bundy. And last but not least is Ted Bundy, a name synonymous with the chilling specter of serial murder. Born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, Bundy's early life seemed unremarkable, but beneath the surface, there were signs of the darkness that would later define him. As a child, he displayed an interest in the macabre, and his teenage years were marred by petty theft and peeping into windows. Bundy's intelligence and charisma allowed him to maintain a facade of normalcy. However, it all began to crumble in the early 1970s. Bundy embarked on a horrific spree of violence that spanned several states, including Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. He preyed primarily on young women, using his charm to lure them into danger. Bundy's method was brutal and calculated. He would often bludgeon his victims and then strangle them to death. The true number of his victims remains unknown, but he confessed to 30 homicides, though estimates suggest the actual count could be much higher. Bundy's reign of terror led to his first arrest in 1975 in Utah, but it was only the beginning of a long and complex legal journey. He was extradited to Colorado to stand trial for murder, but escaped from custody, only to be recaptured and then escape again. eventually making his way to Florida. There, his violent impulses resurfaced with renewed ferocity, leading to more assaults and murders, including the infamous Chi Omega sorority house killings. Finally apprehended in 1978, Bundy faced trials that were as sensational as his crimes. Representing himself in court, he displayed a disturbing mix of charm and arrogance. Despite overwhelming evidence, including eyewitness testimony and forensic data, Bundy maintained his innocence. However, the jury was not swayed, and he was convicted and sentenced to death. On death row, he began to reveal details of his crimes, offering confessions in a bid for clemency that never came. His last hours were a media spectacle, and crowds gathered outside the prison. His last night was spent in isolation, save for a final phone call to his mother. On January 24, 1989, Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison.